Well, hello everybody. This is Dr. Bruce Faske from Arkansas State University, and I'm here today to give you my final tutorial of the 2023-2024 set of etudes for ASBOA Junior High All-Region Trombone auditions later this year. If you go to the YouTube channel and look at the playlists, you'll find last year's set, and this video completes this year's set for 2023-2024. So you can find those by playlist, you can find individual videos. I've tried to give each of them a thumbnail so that it's easy to find the one that you're looking for. And I also put in the comments the actual link to the PDF with the official paperwork from ASBOA to let you know all the things you need to know about the upcoming audition. So let's go ahead and do what we've done with all the other videos. As I've explained before, but it's worth mentioning again, I like to do a version of sight reading PEMDAS. Now, for those of you that have not had this part of math class yet, PEMDAS is an order of operations to know how to solve a complicated equation. The P stands for parentheses, and you go through E, exponents, M, multiplication, D, division, A, addition, and S, subtraction. If you do those things in the correct order, you'll get the correct answer. If you do them in the incorrect order, you may not get the correct answer. I guess really you will not get the correct answer. So it's important when we're learning new music to find our own musical version of PEMDAS that we can do with that. And the way that I walk every one of my students through this process is to start with the very, very top left of the music and work our way down all the way to bottom right, if that's where the music ends. So if we start in the top left corner of number 36, page 19, we'll see that we have a bass clef, which is important to double check on because there's another book that looks just like this by Getchell. It's a trumpet book, treble clef, not the same etudes. So you want to make sure that you got the correct copy. So you have bass clef, we have 4 flats, and in this case, the 4 flats are A flat major, B flat, E flat, A flat, and D flat. The time signature for this etude is 2/4 time. 2 counts per measure, and the quarter note gets the beat. If you were conducting it, it would look like this. 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2. We also have a word above the top of the first measure, allegretto. It's a little bit slower than allegro. Etto is an Italian suffix, and it means little version of, or smaller version of. In this case, a little slower version of allegro. And then we have a dynamic marked underneath the first measure of mezzo forte. And if you scan the rest of the etude, there are no other markings to deal with in this etude, which is a blessing and a curse. One of the ways that it's a blessing is there's not extra stuff to get in your way and confuse you and to murky the waters and make it more difficult to figure out. However, the way that it's a curse is that it can start to be very bland and very flatlined and very boring. And so I'm going to try to give you some ideas about how you can spice it up and make it a little bit more interesting while also retaining the original spirit that the composer intended when he wrote the etude. So we're dealing with couplets of measures here. We have the first measure, which the 8th note, followed by 2/16, followed by 2 8th notes on beat 2, followed by a second measure of straight 8th notes. And then you'll see that the pattern repeats itself many, many times in a row, with just a couple of exceptions. So measures 1 and 2 have one rhythmic set, and then even though there's different pitches, we have the same rhythmic pattern and general contour is the same in measures 3 and 4. Measures 5 and 6, similar again. And 7 is like the beginning, but 8 is a little bit different in that it's a quarter note followed by 2 8th notes. When you have sets of measures that follow each other and they share a specific characteristic, rhythm, overall contour of intervals, distances between the note, this is called a sequence. It's stating something and then stating it slightly differently, slightly differently, slightly differently. It's a way to have variety, but also have sort of uniformity in your music. And it's also makes it somewhat difficult in some cases to create musical line. If you've been here with me for the other videos, you know that I harp on the concept of musical line quite a bit. Even if it's not a lyrical etude, it can still have direction and flow. So we have to figure out how to make this all work in the bigger context of where do I need to breathe musically, but then where do I need to breathe for my body when my body starts, screaming at me on the inside saying, take a breath, take a breath, take a breath. How can we make both of those things work so that one is not necessarily at the service of the other, but they're working together? Well, the first thing that I would recommend that you do is you try to play a little bit to determine where you think the first phrase ends. So if I've got my trombone here, I'm going to play from the beginning, and I'm going to stop where I feel like the first natural phrase ending happens. To me, because we're in the key of A flat, and I stopped on an A flat, 3, 2, 1, da, da, da. Those last three notes really do a great job of bringing us back home. Now, I actually think that the phrase ends on the B flat in the first measure of the second line. So you take your pencil, or in my case, my Apple pencil, and I'm going to mark a breath after the B flat quarter note in the first measure of the second line. And so if I'm playing it that way, those two eighth notes that follow the breath are actually part of the next phrase. Let me see if I can explain that with my way of playing it. Did you hear the natural break between those two? Now, I want to play it incorrectly, or in a way that's not as strong musically, so maybe you can hear a difference and hear why I chose to do it the other way. Here's a way that is commonly played, and I think it's okay, but we're trying to do better than okay. You're checking out a YouTube video about trombone music to get better at the instrument, right? So you're going to go above and beyond, right? Yeah, I thought so. Did you hear how choppy that was? I basically decided to do two measure phrases, and no matter what, I was going to breathe at the end on the bar line of that second measure. And it just does something to the music. It takes, for me, frankly, it takes the music out of the equation, and it turns it into a very robotic and boring thing. Now, do you remember back at the beginning of the video when I talked about how there's only one printed dynamic and it runs the risk of becoming sort of bland and boring? Well, if you breathe in a way that also becomes bland and boring, you have a double order of bland. It's like oatmeal with nothing in it. It's like, I don't know, just not very interesting to listen to, in the same way that bland food is not always the most interesting thing to eat. So we want to find a way to make sure that we create phrase integrity in what we're doing here. So I think it's okay to breathe when you need to breathe, but we need to find the best place to breathe. So if we agree that we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 and a half measures is the first sort of big musical phrase, I'm not expecting you to go 7 and a half measures on one breath. I'm probably not going to go 7 and a half measures on one breath, but I need to try to find a place that's somewhere near the middle of those 7 and a half measures. So if we think about 7.5 and we divide that in two, that's 3.25, 3 and a quarter. So if I look 3 measures and a quarter or so into the etude, we can start to see where a likely location is for that first breath. And so let me play again and see if I can find a good musical spot for that first breath after we play it from the beginning. Now, my lungs can handle playing on for a little bit. I can do it. But if I had to breathe somewhere, I think I would probably breathe in measure 3 after the first G before the 2 16th notes. Let's try that. So I was able to catch a little breath in there. You don't need to take the biggest breath in the world right there. It's just getting you to the next place where you would take your next full breath. It's just a little sip breath, or as one of my teachers used to say, a sniff breath. Just a little bit, just enough to keep you going, just like putting a little bit of gas in the car. If your car runs out of gas, you don't go and fill up a 20-gallon barrel and roll it to the car. You get 1 gallon and you try to get the car to the gas station where you can fill everything up. So if you need to breathe somewhere, you want to find a place that's roughly symmetrical. Now, 7.5 is not an even number. So the halfway point is also not going to be even. But we can find a spot that's musically satisfying and is in a general zone that makes sense in terms of the symmetry of both halves. Because when we breathe, we're effectively taking that 7.5 and we're cutting it in half at least once. We're breaking it into multiple parts. You might even have another spot in there where you want to take a breath. But I think if you can get one breath in, that might be a good place to do it. You want to breathe before you really need to breathe. Going on for the second phrase, if I start in the second half of the second half of the second measure of the second line on the C and the B flat, we're going to find that the next phrase ends all the way on the third line, third measure, on the half note A flat. Remember I said from the beginning that we're in the key of A flat. We're ending on an A flat. That's probably a good clue that, especially if it's a longer note duration than anything else around it, it's a good clue that we're coming to a resting point, a stopping point. We're coming back home. So let me see if I can play it in a way that illustrates that. To me, that's pretty straightforward. Now, the same rule applies if you need to sneak a breath in. Try to sneak it somewhere towards the middle of the phrase. Don't breathe right before the end of the phrase, because then any little tag in that you have at the end of that is not gonna make sense musically either. So you want to make sure that when you take a breath, that you're taking it somewhere that allows that symmetry to continue. So I think that that's the first big arrival point. The first really, really big arrival point. The third measure of the third line. Everything that happens up to that is one big musical idea or one musical section. Now, what happens next, you're going to want to talk to your teachers about this at your school because they may disagree with me on this point. But I think what we can do here in this middle section is we can change the dynamic a little bit. We can do something different musically that also retains the original spirit of the music. So we're not going to change the speed. We're not going to change the articulation, but we are going to change the volume a little bit. So let's try a couple things. I'm going to start at the beginning of the third line to get into the change so that you can hear the old section that we already know and then the new section and see if this makes sense musically. So do you notice how I lightened up? It's a little softer through this whole section. I'm trying to create some contrast there. I'm not slowing down. I'm not really changing my articulation, but I am creating some contrast in terms of dynamics. So you might consider taking your pencil and in the fourth measure of the third line, maybe write mezzo piano. If you don't tend to do enough of a dynamic shift when there are dynamic changes, maybe write in piano or piano plus or something to let you know that it needs to be enough different from what you did before that a listener can tell without looking at the music. You want to make it clear to them. So one of the things that we have to do with this music is we have to figure out the roadmap for the rest of the thing, right? We've played the opening section. We've played the middle section. We talked about making that middle section maybe a little bit softer to create some contrast since the composer didn't write any other dynamics in other than mezzo forte. But now I want to find a way to bring it on home, as they might say in the old days. We want to see if there's any material from the beginning that's sort of restated here at the end. Because when we can have familiar material that we've heard before, maybe we can follow the same stylistic choices that we made at the beginning at the end. Basically, what I'm saying is we made this change to go a little bit softer in the middle. Does it ever go back to the printed mezzo forte? Do we ever find that place where it sounds like the beginning again? So I'm going to see if I can find that in the music. I'm going to play the last couple of lines. Okay, so we did find something that sounded like part of the beginning. I think that what we're dealing with is not a direct return, but a similar return. We just need to find the point where we go back to the original dynamic. I actually think that the perfect place to do this, we're going to do a little bit of a crescendo in the fourth line, third measure. And we're going to crescendo over 4 measures so that we can return back to mezzo forte for the last 2 lines. Let me see if I can demonstrate that. I'm going to start in the fourth line. So I tried to play it, and sometimes it may not actually come across in the recording the way that I want it to, but it should give you an idea that we're trying to start with one idea, and we're going to call that first idea home. And then we're going to leave home. We're going to go to the store. We're going to go to the park. We're going to go somewhere else. We're going to change something slightly. In this case, we're changing the dynamic. And then we have to find a way to come back to the thing that we started with. And you can't just abruptly do that. I mean, you can. You can always do that if you choose to. But musically, it makes more sense to find a segue, a path, a way to do it more gently so that before the listener knows it, oh, we're back at stuff that I've heard before. And that's a really, really easy way to do that. So in recap, we're going to start at the beginning, mezzo forte as printed. We're going to play all the way down to the third measure of the third line. At the end of that measure, we're going to drop the dynamic down just a little bit so that from the fourth measure of the third line all the way through the end of the fourth line, we're dealing with a softer dynamic, and we're returning to the louder dynamic for the last 2 lines. And with one more change, we're going to add a crescendo over the last 4 measures of the fourth line to create a transition to the original dynamic. So if we go through this in that way, hopefully that gives you some help in terms of how the etude is structured. Now I want to talk to you a little bit about articulation. So one of the biggest challenges you're going to face with this etude is making the articulations clean. It's really easy when we're dealing with quarter notes and maybe even eighth notes to keep everything clean. But when we're dealing with 16th notes, something seems to change for trombone players. It's something that I've noticed in all age groups. When 16th notes show up, we play differently, and we really shouldn't. The ingredient that people don't often talk about when it comes to playing articulated passages well is what we do with our air. It's not always just about the tongue. And I really believe this to the core of who I am as a musician, so I'm going to take a second and explain what I'm talking about. So, very rudimentary. Let's say that this is the roof of your mouth, the top, this part of my hand, the fingers, and this part of my hand is your top teeth, okay? So this is the tongue, right? So the tongue's kind of at rest, and then when you articulate, ta, 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 it hits somewhere behind the top teeth. We're not going to get into big details about that right now, but we can all agree that hopefully it hits somewhere behind the top teeth. Now, if I tongue harder and harder and harder and harder, at some point, it's one of the strongest muscles in the body. It can stay in position, and the air can't get past it. And then all of a sudden, your tonguing is sort of like clubby and slow and lumberous. We need to be able to keep that tongue moving quickly and moving efficiently And we got to remember that we only need to really worry about the upward motion of the tongue to the roof of the mouth or to the section behind the top teeth. The wind that's coming out here from the lungs, like up and out, it's going to push the tongue out of the way. So if we are responsible for this part and let the air or the wind be responsible for this part, then we can tongue much more quickly. But we have to make sure that we're blowing wind in a consistent way. We want to make sure that our inhales touch our exhales. And here's what I mean by that. Often you'll have a player, if they're in a band, the conductor will count them in 1, 2, ready. And then we hold the air back and then explode it out. Well, it's not the best way to use our air. The better way to use the air is to make the inhale touch the exhale and the exhale touch the inhale. And here's what I mean. You don't stop the air between the two. Instead of now, I'm exaggerating to make my point. But when you stop the air, something has to stop it, right? If the air is stopped, you're either tight in your throat, you're tight at your lips, you're tight somewhere, you're closing off the air. So instead, make those inhales and exhales touch and keep the wind moving, and I promise that your tonguing is going to get better. Now, there's a couple things that you can do that can help you to time this out correctly. Take the 16th notes out. Simply play the beginning section with just eighth notes. There's nothing wrong with doing that to time the slide in and make sure that you're putting the slide in the right spot for every note. Then you can add the 16th notes back in. One of the other things that you can do is to play more 16th notes. I'm going to see if I can do this. It may not be perfect because I'm kind of doing this on the spot, but let me see if I can do what I'm talking about. You see what I did? I turned the downbeat of 2 into 2 16th notes. I'm increasing the load. I'm making it more difficult so that when you go back to the printed music, all of a sudden it's a little bit easier. But the common thing in all of that is that I'm using my wind in a way to aid the tongue rather than having them fight each other the whole time. Now, other than that, in this etude, there's not a lot of alternate positions to concern ourselves with. There's nothing strange marked on the part. I want to draw your attention to one section that could be a little bit dicey where the pattern indeed changes. And we're dealing with the last 3 measures of the 5th line. So I'm going to play it through for you slowly, and I recommend that you play through this stuff slowly as well to make sure that you're putting the correct accidentals in the correct place. So you see how that worked? We have A flat, E flat, E flat, D, E flat, A flat, E natural, E natural, E flat, E natural, then back to A flat because at the end of the measure the accidental goes away and we go back to the key signature. I'm going to play it one more time. I hope you can hear that. I also have it, at the top of the page, or top of the screen, so you can see what I'm talking about in the music. Just be particularly careful, and if you need to, write a couple of positions in if it helps you along the way. And so that's basically my explanation and walkthrough of Etude number 36. I hope this is helpful. I hope this whole series has been helpful. In this Etude, it's pretty straightforward. It doesn't mean that it's easier or it requires less work. It just requires less explanation. You've got work to do. We all have work to do. But remember, when you're going through all these, to give yourself reasonable goals. Don't feel like you have to learn the whole etude right away just because I demonstrated the whole thing for you. Take your time. Don't take too much time, but take your time. A really quick story. When I was in high school, I had a series of chores that I had to get done. And one of the chores that I was responsible for was sweeping out the garage. It's a big 3-car garage. And for whatever reason, the spiders just loved our garage. So there were spider webs everywhere. And if I wanted to go out on an evening with friends or go out on a date, I had to get that and a few other things done before I could go. Well, I would rush through the job, and then my dad would come home from work, and he would sort of inspect it. And if he was happy with my work, I was free to go. I can't tell you how many times he wasn't happy with my work because I rushed through it. And one of the great quotes that I've ever heard in my life reminded me of the story with my dad. If you don't have time to do it right, when will you have time to do it over? And what that means to me as a musician is I can rush through all this stuff with the goal of getting to the end every time. And I can let a lot of things go by that I don't pay particular attention to. But what I run the risk of when I do that, I run the risk of learning things incorrectly, reading things incorrectly and interpreting them incorrectly. I also run the risk of memorizing these things so that it's so much harder to go back and fix them later. You can almost make it seem like the way that you've decided to play it is correct even if it's not, because it's the thing that you've played over and over again. And you may be the most dutiful practicer in the world, doing absolutely everything that your directors tell you to do, 45 minutes a day, an hour a day. But if you're doing the wrong thing for an hour, you're reinforcing a bad habit or a mistake, and it will be that much more difficult to fix later. So it would be better for you to slow down, do it right the first time, seek out help when you don't understand something. And that brings me to my final point. Yes, I'm here to do these videos for you, for those of you who may not be able to come to Jonesboro for a lesson. But if you ever find yourself in this part of the state and you'd like to sit down with me and do a one-on-one lesson, I'm more than happy to accommodate you. I also teach online on Zoom, and while it's not ideal, it's better than nothing. But more than anything, I hope that you have a great experience with this process. I hope that you grow as a musician. I hope that your love of music grows from this, and that you can recognize that the real benefit of doing this is not the chair that you're going to get in All-Region or All-State, but the growth that you have along the way and what you learn about yourself. So best of luck to you. I'm going to be coming out with more videos soon, even though this is the last one in this series. But I hope it's been helpful, and I hope to hear from you. Take care, and remember, wolves up.